on America's Olympic Network, NBC.
Well, some local veterans honored fallen veterans today by placing flags on their tombstones.
And it may have taken a few generations, but one veteran has finally received his due on it. Good evening, everyone. And thanks for joining us. I'm Rick Albin.
And I'm Andrea Moorhead. Well, we have a special story tonight about a local family's fight to clear the name of a United States war veteran.
The case involves a man who fought in the Civil War and spent the rest of his life trying to convince the government that he wasn't a deserter. News 8's Raj Chauhan has been following the story. This is a particularly touching story and very appropriate for this weekend.
Absolutely. His name was Peter DuShane. He grew up in Grand Haven in the mid-1800s, fought in the Civil War, and was later declared a deserter. He spent the next 32 years trying to change that label. Now, 3 generations later, a Kentwood family picked up the fight again. For the descendants of Peter DuShane, the story begins here, in a humble corner of this Grand Haven cemetery. The gravestone itself is difficult to find, tucked behind a tree and hidden from plain view, much like the truth about DuShane's military service during the Civil War. For 3 generations, he was labeled a deserter.
I had heard that he was in the Civil War, and that was all.
Roberta Burke never met her grandfather, who died years before she was born. His memory survives in a few fragments of the family album, a few stories in the family folklore. But in 1968, she wanted to learn the complete story and began a genealogy search that led to the puzzling case of Peter DuShane, an illiterate farmer who allegedly deserted the United States Army during the Civil War.
Well, there was a big question mark there. I guess I don't like question marks. It's like a mystery, and you want to see what you can do to find the right answers.
I'd always heard that my great-grandfather had been in the Civil War, and I had heard that he had deserted from a prison camp.
But he couldn't understand how DuShane could be accused of deserting from a prison camp. 2 years ago, Campbell went to the National Archive in Washington, D.C. and found the documents that answered his questions. In 1862, Private Peter DuShane enlisted in Company G of the 21st Michigan Infantry Regiment. He saw action at Crab Orchard, Kentucky in the Battle of Perryville. But it was during the Battle of Stones River that DuShane was wounded and taken prisoner. As was customary at the time, prisoners of war were allowed to return to their homes, honor-bound not to rejoin the fight until a formal prisoner exchange occurred between the North and the South. The problem DuShane had was that he was never notified that he'd been exchanged. Because of a clerical error, he never reported back to his unit. The Army classified him as a deserter and gave him a dishonorable discharge. He spent the rest of his life trying to correct the mistake.
He had spent something like 36 years himself trying to clear the record, and I thought if it meant that much to him, it meant that much to me.
The next generation, Robert McDonald, lobbied local members of Congress who convinced the Army to review DuShane's case. 2 years later, a letter came from the United States Army clearing DuShane's name, changing his discharge to that of honorable service.
Peter saw action during the Civil War. He was wounded during the Civil War and was a patriot.
I thought I didn't ever think he could do it, but he did.
A number of men in our family have been in service and been in several wars, and this just is a pride thing.
And now, 132 years later, it's finally straightened out, and the name Peter DuShane has officially been cleared, much to the relief of his family.
What a remarkable story, because anybody that's ever had to go through that paperwork nightmare out there, I mean, it can be really frustrating.
The bureaucracy can be intense.
But they stuck with it. That's really
And
impressive.
they won out. That's great.
Good story. Thank you, Raj.
And